There is a question that a reporter once put to an elderly woman living quietly in Beverly Hills, decades after her famous marriage had ended. She had been asked it many times over the years, and her answer never changed. Why? The reporter wanted to know, had she never remarried? She had been young when the marriage ended, still beautiful, and she had lived a long life since. She could have found love again a dozen times over. The woman looked at him, and with 2 words she said everything there was to say about the man who had left her. After Sinatra, her name was Nancy Barbato, and she was the first of the 4 women who married Frank Sinatra. And that single, devastating answer, given by a woman he had cheated on and abandoned decades earlier, tells you almost everything you need to understand about the strange, magnetic, destructive pull this one man had on the women who loved him. Because here is the truth that gets lost beneath all the glamour, the tuxedos, the swaggering Rat Pack image, and the greatest voice of the 20th century. Frank Sinatra was married 4 times, and not one of those marriages was simple. Each of the 4 women who took his name lived a life shaped, and in some cases shattered, by the experience of loving him. And each of them walked away from that marriage, carrying something very different. One was the childhood sweetheart who stood by him before the world knew his name, only to be discarded once it did, and who then spent the rest of her long life still, somehow, loving him. One was the smouldering Hollywood goddess whose romance with him burned so hot it nearly destroyed them both, the woman he may have loved most of all and could never live with. One was a delicate young actress, 30 years his junior, whose brief, bewildering marriage to him ended over a movie, and who went on to a life more turbulent than anyone could have predicted. And one was the glamorous former showgirl who finally tamed him in his old age, and who then spent decades locked in a quiet war with his own children over what he left behind. What ties all 4 of these women together is something stranger and more haunting than the simple fact that they all married the same famous man. It is that not one of them ever seemed able to fully escape him. He was, by every account, the defining relationship of each of their lives, the standard against which everything before and after was measured. 2 of them never remarried at all. A third stayed loyal to his memory for decades, after a marriage that lasted barely 2 years. And the 4th fought to protect her claim on him, long after he was gone. This is not the story of a man who broke hearts and moved on. It is the story of a man who left a permanent imprint on every woman who loved him, for better and very often for worse. Their names were Nancy, Ava, Mia, and Barbara. And what really happened to the 4 wives of Frank Sinatra, beyond the headlines and the legend, is a story about devotion, betrayal, obsession, and the enormous, complicated cost of loving a man the whole world wanted a piece of. Let's begin at the beginning with the girl from New Jersey who loved him before he was anyone at all. The first wife who never stopped loving him. Nancy Barbato was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, in 1917, the daughter of a hard-working Italian-American plasterer, and she met Frank Sinatra in the summertime at the New Jersey shore when she was a teenager and he was a skinny, ambitious 19-year-old with nothing to his name but an enormous belief in himself. This was long before the fame, long before the money, long before Ava Gardner or Las Vegas or any of it. He was a singing waiter, hustling for gigs. She was working as a secretary, and she believed in him when there was almost nothing yet to believe in. They married in February of 1939, during the tail end of the Great Depression. 2 young people from working-class Italian families starting out with next to nothing. And in those early years, Nancy was far more than a wife. She was his anchor, his support system, the steady foundation beneath a man whose ambition was about to carry him somewhere neither of them could have imagined. She managed the household, she raised their family, and she waited patiently through the long nights while he chased the career that would eventually make him a legend. Together they had 3 children, Nancy, Frank Jr., and Tina. And for a while they were exactly the kind of devoted young couple that Sinatra himself would later sing about, love and marriage, going together like a horse and carriage. It is worth pausing to appreciate what Nancy gave him in those years, because it was something no amount of later fame could ever replace. She loved Frank Sinatra when he was nobody. She believed in the voice before there was any evidence it would amount to anything. She cooked for the musicians. She stretched the household budget through the lean stretches. and she offered him a home to come back to when the gigs were small and the future was uncertain. In a life that would eventually be filled with people who loved him for what he had become, Nancy was the one who had loved him for who he simply was. That is a rare and precious kind of devotion, and it may be exactly why, decades later, it was her he thought of with the deepest regret. But fame changed everything, as it so often does. As Sinatra rose from a local crooner to a national phenomenon, with bobby soxers screaming in the aisles and his face on magazines across the country, the temptations of that world closed in around him, and he did not resist them. The affairs began, and they were not discreet. The most notorious of them, his passionate involvement with the actress Ava Gardner, played out in the newspapers for all the world and for Nancy to see. Here is the part that reveals just how much Nancy loved him. For years, she refused to divorce him. Even as the affair with Gardner became public, even as the humiliation mounted, she would not let him go. In a rare interview in 1950, with her marriage crumbling in full view of the public, Nancy said something that has echoed ever since. She said she had something too fine and precious to give up. She was talking about her marriage, about her family, about the life she had built with this man since they were both young and poor and unknown. She was not going to surrender it easily, no matter how badly he behaved. But some things cannot be held onto by will alone. Eventually, Nancy relented. And it is worth understanding just how hard those final years were, even for Sinatra. His daughter Tina later wrote that it took her father 2 full years to even ask for the divorce, and that they were among the toughest, most insecure years of his life. His career had gone into a genuine tailspin during that period. His record sales had collapsed, his voice was troubled, his bank account was dwindling, and what money he did have, he sent to Nancy to care for their children. When the divorce was finally granted in 1951, Sinatra married Ava Gardner just days later. And here is where Nancy's story becomes something more than the tale of a wronged first wife. Because she never remarried. Not once. In all the long decades that followed. She lived on, raising their 3 children, remaining remarkably on cordial terms with the man who had left her, and quietly carrying a torch for him that never went out. Her daughter and granddaughter both said the same thing in later years, that Nancy never stopped loving Frank, and that he, in his own way, never stopped loving her either. When his own daughter once asked him directly whether, if he could do it all over again, he would still have left Nancy for Ava, Sinatra reportedly answered with a single word: no. Nancy Barbato Sinatra lived to the astonishing age of 101, passing away in 2018, more than 79 years after she first married him and 20 years after his own death. She had outlived him, outlived Ava, outlived nearly everyone from that era. And when reporters asked, in those final decades, why she had spent a lifetime alone rather than remarry, her answer was always the same. After Sinatra, who else could there possibly be? It is one of the great sad love stories of the 20th century, and the woman at the center of it was not a glamorous movie star. She was a secretary from New Jersey who loved a poor young singer before the world ever heard of him, and who never quite managed to stop. If Nancy was the great steady love that Sinatra threw away, the woman he threw her away for was something else entirely. Ava Gardner was not a foundation. She was a firestorm, and their marriage would become one of the most explosive love affairs in Hollywood history. The great love that burned too hot. Ava Gardner was a farmer's daughter from rural North Carolina, one of 7 children, who arrived in Hollywood with almost impossibly good looks, and became, over the course of the 1940s, one of the most celebrated beauties in the world, a genuine screen goddess. By the time she and Sinatra fell into each other's orbit at the end of that decade, she had already been through 2 brief failed marriages, and she was, by every account, as strong-willed, as fiery, and as untamable as he was. The attraction between them was immediate and overwhelming. Sinatra, the story goes, had seen a photograph of her even before they properly met and declared that he was going to marry that woman. He was still married to Nancy at the time. It did not matter. Neither of them cared what anyone thought. They plunged into an affair so passionate and so public that it scandalized even Hollywood, a town not easily scandalized. And when Sinatra's divorce from Nancy finally came through in 1951, he and Ava married within days. In Philadelphia, she in a cocktail dress, he at the lowest point of his professional life. Because that is the crucial context for their marriage, and it is a piece of the story that rarely gets told. When Frank married Ava, he was not the untouchable icon of legend. He was a fading star whose career had collapsed. His records were not selling. His voice had been troubled by a vocal cord hemorrhage. The screaming fans had moved on. And in this period of his deepest professional humiliation, it was Ava Gardner, the bigger star by far at that moment, who was the breadwinner. It was Ava who reportedly used her own Hollywood clout to help him land the role that would resurrect his entire career, the part of Maggio in the 1953 film From Here to Eternity, which won him an Academy Award and brought him roaring back to the top. You would think that would have bound them together forever. Instead, it may have helped tear them apart. Because the imbalance of it, the proud, volatile Sinatra, dependent on his wife's fame and money during those lean years, created a wound that their equally volatile temperaments could not heal. They loved each other ferociously, and they fought each other just as ferociously. Their marriage was a series of spectacular clashes, screaming matches, jealous rages, public brawls, and passionate reconciliations. Friends who knew them described a relationship so intense it was almost impossible to be around. Two enormous personalities colliding again and again with no one willing to back down. Sinatra himself, late in life, described the whole thing to a close friend with a kind of rueful honesty that says everything. He said he should have known from the start that anything that burned that hot was bound to burn out, but that while it was going on, he was having the time of his life. That is the essence of Frank and Ava in a single thought. It was never going to last, and it was never going to be forgotten. Ava, for her part, was every bit his match. A woman who could out-drink him, out-curse him, and out-argue him, who refused to be diminished or controlled by the most powerful entertainer in the world. In an era when women were so often expected to shrink themselves beside famous men, Ava Gardner did the opposite. She met Sinatra as an equal, and neither of them ever quite recovered from the collision. The pain ran deeper than the fights. During their marriage, Ava became pregnant, more than once, and she chose to end those pregnancies, a decision she made during a period when their relationship was in chaos, and she doubted the marriage could survive. She reportedly came to carry real sorrow about it in later years. Sinatra, for his part, was said to have been driven to the depths of despair by the turbulence of their union, his emotional state during those years as fragile as it ever was. This was not a happy marriage. It was a consuming one, which is a very different thing. By 1953, they had separated, and the divorce was finalized in 1957. And yet, here is the strange and haunting truth about Frank and Ava. Divorce did not end their love. It may have been the only thing that allowed it to survive. Freed from the impossible daily friction of actually being married, the two of them remained deeply, permanently connected for the rest of their lives. Sinatra reportedly sent her flowers. Ava kept a photograph from the early days of their romance by her bedside until the end. Many who knew them believed that Ava Gardner was the great love of Frank Sinatra's life, the one who got away, or perhaps the one he drove away, the woman he measured every other against and could never quite replace. Ava, like Nancy before her, never remarried after Sinatra. She moved to London and lived out her later years there, her health declining, her legendary beauty weathered by hard living and hard drinking. She had been one of the most photographed faces in the world, a woman whose looks had stopped rooms, and she grew old far from Hollywood, in a quieter and more solitary life than her glittering fame might have suggested. But the thread connecting her to Sinatra never broke. Even in those later, diminished years, the two of them stayed in contact, and when illness left Ava in real financial and physical difficulty, Sinatra reportedly helped quietly cover her medical costs, still looking after the woman he had divorced decades earlier. It was the kind of loyalty that outlasted the marriage entirely, the enduring tenderness of a love that could not survive as a marriage but refused to die as anything else. When she died in 1990, at just 67, Sinatra was said to have been utterly inconsolable, reportedly weeping and saying that he should have been there for her. He outlived the great love of his life by 8 years, and by many accounts he never fully got over losing her. 2 marriages down, and already a pattern emerges that cuts against the whole swaggering legend. This was not a man who conquered women and moved on. This was a man haunted by the ones he lost. And then, into the life of this middle-aged, twice-divorced legend, came a 21-year-old with a pixie haircut, who could not have been more different from the fiery Ava Gardner if she had tried. The child bride and the marriage that baffled the world. In the mid-1960s, Frank Sinatra was in his 50s, one of the most famous men on the planet, a titan of music and film and Las Vegas. And he stunned the entire world by falling for and marrying Mia Farrow, a delicate, waifish young actress who was just 21 years old, barely more than half his age. She was 30 years his junior. She was younger, in fact, than his own eldest daughter. The age gap alone made it one of the most talked-about marriages of the decade. Mia Farrow was Hollywood royalty in her own right, the daughter of a film director and a famous actress. And at the time she married Sinatra, in 1966, she was just beginning to build her own career, best known for a role on a popular television series. The pairing seemed almost inexplicable to observers. The grizzled, old-school crooner from the Depression era and the ethereal young flower child of the swinging 60s. Sinatra's friends were reportedly baffled. The public was fascinated. And the marriage, from the very start, sat on a fault line that would soon crack wide open. Because the thing that came between Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow was not another affair, or money, or the age gap itself. It was her career. Mia was cast in what would become one of the defining films of the era, the psychological horror classic, Rosemary's Baby. The shoot ran long, dragging past the point where Sinatra had expected her to be finished, and he wanted her to leave the production to be with him, to prioritize their marriage over her work. She refused. She stayed with the film that would make her a star. And according to Hollywood legend, Sinatra responded by having his lawyer serve her with divorce papers on the very set of the movie, in the middle of filming. There is something almost tragically revealing in that conflict, because it exposed the fundamental mismatch at the heart of the marriage. Sinatra was a man of an older generation and an older code, who expected a wife to organize her life around his. Mia was a young woman coming of age at the dawn of a new era, one in which women were beginning to insist on their own ambitions and their own identities. He wanted a companion who would drop everything for him. She wanted to become an artist in her own right. Neither of them was necessarily wrong, but they were pulling in opposite directions, and the gap between their worlds turned out to be far wider than the 30 years that separated their birthdays. The marriage was not destroyed by a lack of love. It was destroyed by 2 people who wanted fundamentally different kinds of life. Whatever the precise details, the marriage was over almost as quickly as it began, ending in divorce in 1968 after less than 2 years. It was, in the arc of Sinatra's life, the briefest and in some ways the most bewildering of his 4 marriages, a union between 2 people from such different worlds that it perhaps never had a real chance. And yet, like the others, it did not curdle into hatred. Remarkably, Sinatra and Farrow remained friends for the rest of his life. Their bond, forged in that strange brief marriage, proved unexpectedly durable, outlasting the romance entirely. In fact, that friendship became the source of one of the most persistent rumors in modern Hollywood history. Decades later, Mia Farrow, long after their divorce, suggested that Sinatra might possibly have been the biological father of her son Ronan, born during her later relationship with the filmmaker Woody Allen. It was a startling comment that set off a media frenzy, and it was never established as fact. Those close to Sinatra have pushed back on it, arguing that if it were true, Frank would have acknowledged the child, as he was a man who took such responsibilities seriously. What the rumor really revealed, more than anything about paternity, was just how deep and lasting the connection between Frank and Mia had remained, all those years after their 2-year marriage fell apart. Mia Farrow's own life, of course, went on to become extraordinarily eventful and often painful in the decades that followed. She built a remarkable career as an actress, appearing in a long string of acclaimed films through the 1970s and 1980s, many of them during her creative partnership with Woody Allen. She became a devoted mother to a large family of biological and adopted children, gathering sons and daughters from around the world under one roof. And she eventually found herself at the center of one of the most notorious and disturbing family scandals in American celebrity history, involving the collapse of that relationship with Alan, a wrenching saga that has never fully left the public eye. In her later years, she has become a dedicated humanitarian and activist, using her fame to draw attention to human rights crises around the world. But all of that came long after Sinatra. Of the four wives, she is the only one still living today, the last surviving link to the man himself, carrying her own memories of that brief, baffling marriage into the present day. And notably, she has never spoken of Sinatra with the bitterness one might expect from a woman served divorce papers on a film set. Quite the opposite. She has reportedly kept warm memories of him, spoken of his loyalty and his protectiveness, and treasured the strange, unlikely bond they shared. Even the shortest of Frank Sinatra's marriages, it seems, left behind not resentment, but a lasting and complicated affection. 3 marriages, 3 wildly different women, and still Frank Sinatra had not found the one who would stay. That would take a 4th wife, and a very different kind of woman, one who arrived in his life in his later years and managed to do what no one else ever had. She got him to the end. The wife who stayed, and the war that followed. Barbara Marx was, in some ways, the most unlikely of all 4 wives to become the one who lasted. A former model and Las Vegas showgirl, tall and glamorous, she had been married before, most notably to Zeppo Marx, one of the famous Marx Brothers comedy team. It was through that marriage that she entered Sinatra's world at all. The Marxes were neighbors and friends of Sinatra in the wealthy desert enclave of Rancho Mirage, California, and it was there, in that rarefied social circle, that Barbara and Frank grew close, eventually leaving her marriage behind to be together. They married in 1976, when Sinatra was 60 and had been through the wreckage of 3 previous unions. It was his 4th marriage and her 3rd, and against all the odds set by his history, it endured. Barbara became the woman who was finally there for the long haul, the wife who accompanied the aging legend through the final chapter of his life. The last 2 decades, as the greatest voice of the century slowly wound down. She was his companion through his final tours, his declining health, and his last years, and she remained his wife until the day he died, in May of 1998, at the age of 82. It is worth asking what Barbara had that the other 3 did not. Or perhaps what Sinatra himself had finally become by the time she arrived. He was no longer the hungry young striver Nancy had married, nor the fading, desperate star Ava had rescued, nor the middle-aged icon who had baffled everyone with Mia. He was an old man now, a living legend with nothing left to prove. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he was ready to simply be settled. Barbara, glamorous and worldly and unflappable, having lived plenty of life herself, seemed to understand exactly how to be married to such a man, when to indulge him, and when to stand firm, how to run the grand social life of a Sinatra household. Where his earlier marriages had been defined by turbulence, this one was defined at last by a kind of durable partnership, whatever else can be said about it. And much would be said. Barbara Marx did what none of the others had managed. She stayed to the end. By many accounts, Barbara brought a stability to Sinatra's late life that he had never known, and the 2 of them did real good together. She founded a children's center dedicated to helping young victims of abuse, a cause she poured herself into, and Sinatra supported it in his own way. There is a lovely and often repeated detail about how the sometimes volatile entertainer would come and sit and read to the children at that center, and how Barbara would fund it by having her superstar husband perform concerts and hand over the proceeds. She had a shrewd, practical way of turning his fame into good works, reportedly telling associates that when she needed a large sum for the center, she would simply have Frank do a concert and take half the money for the children. In her role as the wife of the icon, she became a genuine philanthropist, and that children's charity, which continues its work to this day, remains a real and lasting part of her legacy, entirely separate from the family drama that surrounded her marriage. But there is a darker and more complicated side to Barbara's story, and it is the part that truly is the truth nobody talks about. Because Sinatra's marriage to Barbara coincided with a deep and painful rift between the aging singer and the three children of his first marriage, the children of Nancy Barbato. In her own memoir, Sinatra's youngest daughter Tina wrote with real anguish about what she saw as Barbara's role in isolating her father in his final years, in driving a wedge between Frank and his own children, and in maneuvering around questions of his estate and his affairs as his health and his mind declined. It became, by Tina's account, a genuine struggle over access to a dying man, and over what would happen to his fortune and his legacy after he was gone. There were disputes over money, over property, over who could be close to Frank in his final, vulnerable years. Barbara, for her part, told a very different story in her own book, presenting herself as a devoted wife who had loved and cared for Sinatra faithfully to the end. The two accounts are irreconcilable, and there is no neutral version of the truth. This is the part of the Sinatra story that the glossy retrospectives almost always leave out, and it is worth sitting with, because it is so painfully ordinary beneath all the fame. Strip away the celebrity, and what remains is a scenario that plays out in families everywhere. An aging man remarries. His new wife and his grown children from an earlier marriage regard one another with suspicion. As the man's health fails, that suspicion hardens into open conflict over money, over caregiving, over who truly has his best interests at heart. It is one of the most common and most heartbreaking dramas in family life, and it does not spare the rich or the famous. If anything, the enormous fortune and the priceless legacy at stake only raised the temperature. The difference is simply that the Sinatra version was fought out between a Las Vegas showgirl and the daughters of a legend, over the estate of one of the most famous men who ever lived. What is beyond dispute is that Frank Sinatra's final years, and their aftermath, were marked by a bitter, painful family conflict that pitted his last wife against his first family, a conflict that in many ways never fully resolved. Barbara outlived him by nearly 2 decades, remaining the guardian of one version of his legacy, continuing her charitable work, and holding fast to her account of their life together, until her own death in 2017, at the age of 90. She had been the wife who stayed, the one who got the fairy tale ending of a marriage that lasted until death. And yet even that ending came wrapped in conflict, a reminder that with Frank Sinatra, nothing, not even the marriage that finally worked, was ever truly simple. What their stories leave behind: 4 women, 4 marriages, 4 completely different lives, each one bent and shaped by the gravity of the same extraordinary, impossible man. When you lay their stories side by side, something remarkable comes into focus, something that cuts right through the swaggering ring-a-ding-ding legend of Frank Sinatra, the ladies' man. Because the striking thing is not how easily he moved from woman to woman, it is how permanently each of them was marked by him, and how many of them never really let him go. Nancy, the first wife, loved him for 80 years and never remarried, answering after Sinatra, to the very end. Ava, the great fiery love, kept his photograph by her bed until she died and was mourned by him as the one he should have done better by. Even Mia, the briefest wife, stayed his friend for life and spoke of him with a strange tenderness decades later. And Barbara, the last, fought to the end to be recognized as the one who truly kept him. There is a temptation, looking at a man with 4 marriages, to see only a serial heartbreaker, a charming egotist who used women and discarded them. But the real story is sadder and more human than that. Sinatra seems to have been a man who inspired enormous love, and was, in his way, capable of enormous love in return, and who nonetheless could not sustain it, could not stop himself from wounding the very people who loved him most. He left the steady woman for the firestorm, lost the firestorm to their own shared fury, baffled the world with the child bride, and finally found stability only in old age, at the cost of his own children's peace. Each of his wives paid a price for loving him, and each of them, in her own way, seemed to decide that the price was worth it, or at least that they could never quite regret it. Nancy said it best, in those 2 unforgettable words that summed up a lifetime of loving and losing the same man. After Sinatra, what else could there possibly be? He was, for all his flaws, all his betrayals, all his volatility, a genuinely singular figure, and the women who married him spent the rest of their lives in the light and the shadow of that fact. That may be the truest thing these 4 stories reveal. Not that Frank Sinatra was a great husband, because by any honest measure he was not, but that he was an unforgettable one. 4 women gave him their names and their hearts, and not one of them ever fully got him back out of their system. In the end, the greatest voice of the 20th century left behind not just a catalogue of immortal songs, but 4 women whose lives were forever defined by the years they spent loving a man the whole world wanted, and that none of them could ever truly keep. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.